piece of bubble yum, fresh from its wrapper, gives in a way that no other gum had ever given before. Press a thumb into it, and the surface yields completely, sinking down with a softness that has almost no resistance at all, the way a very ripe piece of fruit gives when handled too gently. In 1977, this was a strange sensation. Children who had grown up chewing Bazooka and Double Bubble were used to a firm, slightly waxy resistance, the satisfying density of something that had to be worked. Bubble Yum was different. It was soft before the first chew. It was soft in a way that made children pause, press it again, and then look at it. That small moment of pause is where this story starts. The Lifesavers Company had been working on a new kind of gum for several years, trying to produce something that would be soft and chewable from the very first bite, without the several minutes of jaw work that older gums required before they became pliable. What they eventually produced was a product that felt genuinely novel in the hand, yielding and pale and slightly cushioned, unlike anything on the candy aisle before it. Bubble Yum launched nationally in the United States in 1977, and it moved through grocery stores and corner shops and school vending machines at a pace that surprised even the people who had made it. Children found it and loved it almost immediately. The softness was the point. The softness was the thing. It was also, very quickly, the thing that seemed suspicious. Within months of Bubble Yum's national rollout, a rumor had begun moving through school cafeterias and playgrounds in a number of American cities. The rumor said that the gum was soft because it contained spider eggs. The specific wording varied from town to town and from child to child, but the core of it was consistent. Something was living inside the gum. Something had been put there, or had found its way there, and when the gum was soft in that particular way, it was because of what it contained. The rumor moved with the speed and confidence that only childhood information moves with, passed from one person to another in the particular low voice that signals both urgency and ownership, the voice that says, "This is something not everyone knows yet." A child in a cafeteria in 1977 might hear it this way. A girl 2 tables over had gotten one from a pack her cousin bought, and when she bit into it, she found something inside. Small white things. Her mother had taken her to the doctor. The doctor had confirmed it. The details shifted and multiplied depending on who was telling it, but the essential shape remained. Someone close to someone you knew had direct personal experience of the contamination, and an authority figure had verified it. The hospital, in some versions, was named. The doctor sometimes had a name. The victim was always just one remove away from the person currently speaking, close enough to feel real, distant enough that she could not be questioned. This is how childhood legends move, and have always moved, through the specific social architecture that children inhabit. Before there was any mechanism for information to travel faster than a person could carry it, schoolyards and lunchrooms functioned as the primary distribution networks for everything children knew and feared and suspected about the world. A child in 1977 had no access to the kind of instantaneous verification that would later make certain rumors harder to sustain. What she had was the word of people she trusted, passed through chains of trust that stretched from one friend to another, one older sibling to a younger one neighborhood to the next. The information arrived pre-authenticated by the social relationship through which it traveled. It wasn't a rumor she had read somewhere. It was something her friend had told her, and her friend had heard it from someone who was there. That distinction mattered enormously. The specific structure of the spider egg claim, with its first-hand witness and its confirming medical authority, followed a template that folklorists had been quietly documenting for decades. A story that wants to be believed needs what this one had, a personal connection, a professional voice lending confirmation, and a specific detail, plausible enough not to be immediately dismissed. A named hospital is more convincing than no hospital. A doctor who confirmed it is more convincing than a rumor with no source. The spider egg legend, even in its earliest form, arrived with the infrastructure of credibility built in. What it did not arrive with was any evidence at all. The gum sat in its wrapper. The wrapper said nothing about spiders. The ingredients listed on the packaging, to whatever extent children read them, contained nothing that sounded biological or alive. But the gum was soft. It was soft in a way that older trusted gums were not soft. And softness, in the particular absence of any explanation a child could hold, left a space that imagination could fill. Childhood is a period of intense and largely unarticulated anxiety about commercial food. The processes by which candy is made are entirely invisible to the child who eats it. It arrives in a sealed package, produced by a company whose facilities are located somewhere the child will never visit, made by workers the child will never meet, through methods the child cannot imagine. For most of the history of processed food, children accepted this without question, because the food tasted good and nothing bad had happened yet. But when something about the food changes, when the familiar product suddenly feels different in a way that cannot be explained, the invisible process behind it becomes briefly visible in the mind, and what that mind produces is often not reassuring. Folklorists who study the intersection of food, childhood, and legend have noted that candy occupied a particularly charged psychological space in post-war American children's lives. It sat at the crossing point of several things that were already emotionally loaded. Candy was pleasure, but it was often pleasure that adults controlled and rationed, handing it out as reward and withholding it as consequence. It was indulgence, but it was an indulgence produced entirely by strangers, in processes entirely out of view. It was familiar, but its familiarity was the familiarity of something trusted without being understood. All of this made candy, in the particular psychology of childhood, a natural vessel for contamination myths. The pleasure and the obscurity, and the adult-mediated authority all added up to something that could tip, under the right provocation, into suspicion. Bubblegum provided the provocation. There is something worth noticing about which gums the rumor attached itself to, and which ones it ignored. The spider egg legend, through all its years of transmission and variation, adhered almost exclusively to the new soft-style gums that emerged in the late 1970s. Bubble Yum was its first and most sustained target. Bubblicious, which launched in 1977 as a competing soft-style gum from Warner Lambert, attracted versions of the same rumor. Hubba Bubba, which followed in 1979, was similarly implicated. What none of these gums shared with the rumor's targets was a characteristic the older gums possessed without question: texture that matched expectation. Bazooka had been around since 1947. Double Bubble had been produced in essentially the same form since the 1920s. Children who chewed these gums knew what they were. The firmness was familiar. There was nothing in the chewing of a bazooka that required explanation, because there was nothing in the chewing of a bazooka that felt new. Bubble Yum felt new. Its softness was a texture that had no prior context, no established innocence, and no simple explanation available to a child standing at the candy counter and pressing her thumb thoughtfully into its surface. The rumor filled the gap that the unexplained softness left open. This is the specific and very human mechanism that set the story in motion. Not malice, not organized deception, just the ordinary cognitive tendency to find causes for effects, and the ordinary social tendency to share what feels like important information with the people around you. By the late 1970s, the legend had spread far enough that children in cities where bubble yum had been available for only a few months were already circulating versions of the story that included details elaborated beyond the original, bare claim. In some tellings, the eggs had been found in multiple packs. In some tellings, a specific child had been hospitalized after chewing a piece and had experienced symptoms described in the particular imprecise medical language children use when they are reporting things they half understand. The symptoms varied, the hospitals varied, the number of eggs varied, but the core remained constant, and the core traveled with remarkable fidelity. The softness was the giveaway. The softness was what something had put there, and the something was alive. Legends that survive tend to grow more detailed as they age, because detail lends them the texture of genuine memory. Something that happened is specific. Something invented tends, over time, toward the general. A legend that wants to be believed will accrete specifics the way a rolling stone gathers mass, picking up names and dates and institutional authorities as it moves through successive tellings, each new teller adding the detail that makes it feel most real to the people they know. By the early 1980s, the Bubble Yum legend had acquired the particular density of a story that had been told many times by many people who each believed they were passing on something true. Named hospitals appeared in versions that circulated through certain regions. A doctor who had reportedly confirmed the finding was given, in some tellings, a name and a specialty. The child who had found the eggs was sometimes described in enough specific detail to sound almost like a real person from the local area, though the specific details shifted from community to community in ways that made it clear the child was a kind of template, a narrative placeholder, rather than an actual person anyone could verify. The accumulation of false specifics is one of the signature marks of an urban legend gaining confidence in itself, and the Bubble Yum legend, by the early 1980s, had become, in this sense, a fully mature specimen. Folklorists who study American legends from this period have pointed out that this kind of growth was not unique to the spider egg story, and was not even particularly unusual for food-related myths. Candy and commercial food products had attracted contamination legends for as long as commercial food production had existed, because the same psychological conditions were always present: invisible production, pleasurable consumption, imperfect information, and children whose imaginations were actively filling in the gaps. What the Bubble Yum legend had that many of its predecessors lacked was a specific sensory feature that seemed to demand explanation. The softness was not imaginary, it was genuinely there. Anyone who pressed their thumb into a piece of bubble yum and then pressed it into a piece of bazooka could feel the difference. The rumor offered the only explanation many children had access to for why that difference existed. It was wrong, but it was specific, and it was passed from person to person by people who were genuinely trying to be helpful. Think about what it felt like to pass this story on. A child who had heard the rumor and believed it was not acting from malice when she leaned across the cafeteria table to tell the person beside her. She was performing a small act of social generosity. She was sharing something she thought was important. She was protecting someone she cared about from a danger she believed was real. The fact that the danger was not real does not change the social function of the act. The information traveled on the infrastructure of genuine concern, which is why it traveled so well and so far. In a school cafeteria in 1977, the fluorescent lights would have been doing what fluorescent lights always did in school cafeterias: casting an even, slightly flat illumination over the lunch trays and the milk cartons and the small objects children brought from home or bought at the school store. A piece of bubblegum sitting on a lunch tray beside a small chocolate milk carton would have looked entirely ordinary, pink, wrapped in its small foil and paper wrapper, printed with the brand name in letters that had been designed to look cheerful and approachable, the wrapper half peeled back where someone had already opened it. The surface of the gum itself, pale and slightly yielding under the cafeteria light, softer looking than gum had a right to look. It would have been easy, sitting across from that piece of gum in a school cafeteria in 1977, to lean forward and say what you had heard, and the person across the table would have looked at the gum and then looked back at you with an expression that contained both the unwillingness to believe and the inability to entirely dismiss, because the gum was right there, and it did look soft, and you had heard it from someone who knew. The playground version of the rumor had its own particular character, distinct from the cafeteria version in the way that all playground information had a distinct character. At recess, with the noise of running and the cold air of whatever season it was, and the general organized chaos of 30 children in a blacktop yard, information moved differently. It moved in clusters. A group of children near a fence, or near the wall of the school building where the wind was blocked, or by the monkey bars where the older kids gathered, would form the kind of loose temporary assembly that was perfect for the transmission of something urgent. One person spoke with the particular authority that belonged to someone who had something important to say and knew it. The others leaned in. The authority in these moments was always second-hand. It came not from personal experience, but from the proximity to personal experience, the one reliable currency of childhood social knowledge. The child speaking had heard it from someone who had been there, or whose cousin had been there, or whose neighbor's older sister had a friend who had opened the pack and found something that should not have been there. The distance was always exactly the right distance, close enough to feel real, far enough away that the specific person could not be found and questioned. This structure, with its single remove between the listener and the witness, is so consistent across childhood urban legends that folklorists have given it a name, the friend of a friend. A story told as happening to someone you almost know but cannot quite verify is a story that sits in a particular cognitive space, more credible than pure abstraction and less checkable than a claim about someone standing right in front of you. The Bubblegum legend operated almost exclusively in this space, as most of the better-traveled childhood legends did. By the time the rumor had been circulating for a year or two, it had also begun to acquire the kind of geographic specificity that legends pick up when they settle into a particular region. In some communities, the hospital where the spider eggs had been confirmed was a hospital that community members might actually recognize. The doctor had a name that sounded plausible for the area. The child who had found the eggs was described in terms that suggested she might be, in some vague way, local. None of these details were consistent from one community to the next, which is precisely the point. The legend adapted itself to wherever it found itself, taking on the local coloring it needed to be believable to the people currently hearing it. A legend that is intelligent enough to localize itself is a legend with a significant survival advantage. What is quiet and worth noticing about all of this is how ordinary the transmission was. There was nothing secret about the spider egg story. It was not passed in the shadows. Children told it openly, in daylight, in public spaces, as a piece of information that deserved to be shared because it was relevant to something people were actively consuming. The mothers who heard it from children in cars on the way home from school received it in the particular mode in which adults receive alarming things said by children, with a slight frown, a partial assessment, and no definitive response either way. The mother who said nothing, either confirming or dismissing, who simply frowned slightly at the road ahead while her child waited in the back seat for a verdict, was not being evasive. She was doing what adults do when they hear something that doesn't quite arrive with enough evidence to act on, holding it, turning it over, setting it down without resolution. That unresolved pause, repeated in 1,000 cars and kitchen tables and school pickup lines, was its own kind of fuel for the legend. An adult who dismisses a rumor outright gives a child something to push against, a reason to defend or abandon the story. An adult who neither confirms nor denies leaves the story in its original state, neither reinforced nor refuted, free to continue traveling. The grocery store candy aisle in 1977 was a particular kind of place. The row of gum facing outward from the bottom shelf, organized by brand, showed the older reliable names that had been there for years, alongside the bright new arrivals. Bubblegum had a wrapper that was cheerful and slightly louder in its colors than the gums beside it, sized and shaped to be visible from the middle of the aisle. Bubblicious was there too, in its own packaging, and Hubba Bubba had begun to appear in stores by the end of the decade. The shelf that held all of them was a record of a specific moment in American candy manufacturing, the moment when softness became something to sell. A child standing at that shelf in 1977, examining the new soft gums alongside the familiar firm ones, would have been making a series of small assessments that she could not have articulated, but that were nonetheless real. These are familiar. This one is different. I have heard something about this one. Her hand might have moved toward the bright wrapper and then hesitated, or she might have reached for it immediately, because curiosity and desire are stronger than most childhood rumors. Or she might have turned away toward the bazooka she had always bought before, in the particular way that a known thing is sometimes more comforting than an unknown one, regardless of what the known thing contains. All three of these responses to the rumor were common. Children who had heard the story continued eating bubble yum anyway, because it tasted good, and the risk seemed, on reflection, manageable. Children who had heard the story stopped eating soft gums entirely for a period of weeks or months, and then gradually returned. Children who had not heard the story bought it freely and thought nothing of it. And children who heard the story and chose to stop, who passed along the warning to others, were doing something that felt, from the inside, exactly like responsible social behavior. The rumor did not require belief to travel. It required only plausibility, and the softness of the gum kept the plausibility alive in a way that no similar rumor about bazooka could have managed. You could not press your thumb into a piece of bazooka and feel something that demanded explanation. You could press your thumb into a piece of bubble yum and feel the particular soft give of it, and think for a moment about what might have produced that. The thinking was the opening. The rumor walked through it. What is equally interesting, in the quiet retrospective way that interesting things about childhood culture tend to be, is the rumor's complete indifference to the older hard gums. Bazooka had been around for 3 decades by the time Bubble Yum appeared. Double Bubble was older still. If a rumor about contamination had been looking for a target based purely on prevalence, these would have been the obvious candidates. They were everywhere. Children had been eating them for generations. But no spider egg legend attached itself to Bazooka. No contamination myth found its way into Double Bubble. The familiar gums went unmolested, while the new ones absorbed the suspicion that novelty always carries with it in the particular social world of children who are still working out which things are trustworthy and which ones are not. Novelty is not inherently suspicious, but unexplained novelty in a product that goes directly into the body of a child is a different thing. The softness of bubblegum was not accompanied by any explanation a child could find. There was no information on the packaging about why this gum was different from other gums, no account of what made it feel the way it felt. It simply arrived, tasting good and feeling strange, and the question of why it felt that way found no easy answer on the wrapper or in the material that accompanied it. The rumor was not the answer, but it was an answer, and in the absence of any other, it moved into the space. There is something almost archaeological about the way this story can be reconstructed now, from the particular details that survived its transmission. The softness as trigger, the friend of a friend structure as authentication, the gradually accumulating specifics as the legend matured, the geographic localization as it settled. Each of these features is a readable trace, the way a stratum of rock is readable to someone who knows what conditions produce what layers. The legend looked at this way is not a mistake or a piece of foolishness. It is a document. It records something real about how children in 1977 experienced a genuinely novel product in the absence of any adequate explanation for what made it novel. The spider egg legend spread in its first years through a country that had no mechanism for stopping it or even slowing it down. There was no national database of urban legends. There was no platform where the company whose product was being implicated could respond in real time. There was no forum where a skeptical child could search for the story and find out how many other children in how many other cities had heard the same thing. There was only the movement of people and the stories they carried, flowing from school to school and city to city at the pace of ordinary social life. Consider the specific vector of a child who had moved. American families in the late 1970s moved fairly often, following work, following opportunities, following the particular restless mobility that characterized the post-war American middle class. A child who had grown up in one city and then found herself in another brought everything from her first home with her, habits and phrases and the particular flavors of her old neighborhood's local knowledge. She brought the bubblegum rumor the way she brought everything else, not as a deliberate act, but as part of the ordinary furniture of her memory. It was simply something she knew, the way she knew which television programs came on which evenings, and what the lunch ladies at her old school had always served on Fridays. In the new school, in the new cafeteria, in the first week of navigating the particular social geography of a place that did not yet know her, the spider egg story was something she had that the other children did not. It was a piece of information. It was currency. It made her someone who knew something worth knowing in the specific economy of childhood social value, where knowing things matters and being the person who tells them matters more. She would have found the moment when it was appropriate to say it. Probably at lunch, probably near the beginning of a conversation about candy, probably when someone produced a piece of bubble yum or mentioned the name of the gum in the course of ordinary conversation. She would have leaned forward slightly and lowered her voice to the particular register that signals both importance and intimacy, and she would have said what she had heard, back in her old city, from someone who was there, and the rumor would have arrived, fresh in the new place, already fully formed, already carrying its confirming detail and its personal testimony and its hospital name, already shaped through its months or years of prior circulation into the form most likely to be believed, already traveling. This is how stories move and have always moved, not through organized campaigns or deliberate conspiracies, but through the ordinary movements of ordinary people, carrying ordinary memories from one place to another and setting them down in new soil. The spider egg legend did not need anything except human beings talking to each other, and human beings talking to each other was something that was going to happen anyway, in every cafeteria and on every playground, every day, regardless. The new child sits at her new lunch table. She has found one friend already, or the beginning of one, the tentative connection that forms in the first weeks of a new school when two people discover they share some small piece of common ground. The friend is eating something or considering whether to eat something, and the gum is there in its pink wrapper, soft and slightly unusual in the particular flat light of a school cafeteria anywhere in America, and the new child has something to say about it. She says it the way she would have said it at home, with the same structure and the same particular authority, because the story has already become part of how she tells this thing, already settled into the particular shape that felt most convincing when she heard it back in her old place. She is not inventing anything. She is not exaggerating. She is simply passing on what she received, intact, the way a person carries something carefully when they know it matters. The friend listens. Her expression moves through the small stages: partial attention, growing attention, the slight adjustment of posture that signals genuine interest, and then the quiet, arrested stillness of someone hearing something they cannot immediately resolve. The gum sits between them on the table or in the wrapper beside the lunch tray, unchanged by everything being said about it. In this way, town after town, school after school, cafeteria after cafeteria, the legend completed its slow traverse of the country, arriving in each new place on ordinary human feet, carried by ordinary people who were simply doing what people have always done with stories that seem important enough to share. It did not need a printing press or a broadcast tower or a distribution network of any kind. It needed only the movement of people from place to place, which is the oldest information network in the world, and the oldest sufficient one. The piece of gum sat soft and pale, and entirely itself through all of it, unchanged by what was being said, indifferent to the whispers moving over its surface in the particular worried voices of children who were only doing their best to keep each other safe from something they genuinely believed was there. A female spider does not begin immediately. Before the first thread of silk appears, there is a period of preparation, a slow pressing of legs against a surface, a testing of angles and edges, a deliberate survey of the space available. She moves with the particular patience of an animal that has no interest in hurrying, and when she finally settles, it is with a kind of finality, as though the decision has been made and the work can now begin. What she is about to do will take hours. The eggs she carries are small, far smaller than most people would imagine if asked to picture them, and the structure she will build around them is one of the more quietly remarkable things produced by any creature of her size. She has no plan she can describe. She has no awareness that what she is doing is by any measure worth attention. She simply begins, and the silk begins to come, and the small pale spheres begin to appear, one after another, settling together in a soft mass that she will spend the next several hours enclosing in layer after layer of woven fiber. It is easy to overlook what is happening here. The shed is dim. The spider is small. The process produces no sound. A person walking past the corner where she has settled would see nothing worth pausing for. A small brown shape against a wooden beam, moving slowly and with great concentration over something barely visible. What she is building in that unremarkable corner, in that ordinary dim light, is a sealed and temperature-managed biological structure made from a material more complex than it appears, designed to protect something fragile through the months ahead. The silken mat comes first. Before any eggs are laid, the female spider deposits a flat, roughly circular foundation of silk against the surface she has chosen, testing its adhesion and extending it outward with slow, deliberate movements of her legs and spinnerets. The silk she uses for this foundation is not the same material as the threads she might use to move or to catch prey. Spiders are capable of producing several distinct types of silk from different glands, and the material selected for egg sac construction is a specialized variety, chosen over the long course of evolutionary time for properties that suit the specific task, softer, more insulating, more tightly woven than the strong elastic lines used for movement or the sticky spiral threads used for catching. Each type of silk has its own architecture at the molecular level, its own tensile character, its own particular set of functions that distinguish it from the others. The foundation mat is dense and close, a small platform that will serve as both anchor and cradle. The eggs follow the mat. She deposits them in a cluster, pale and closely gathered, each one resting against the ones beside it in the loose arrangement that the silk beneath holds in place. The cluster is quiet and still. The eggs do not move independently. They have no shell in the hard calcified sense that a bird's egg has. Their outer surface is a membrane, smooth and faintly translucent, giving each sphere a quality something like the surface of a very small pearl, or a seed coated in the lightest possible layer of wax. Where light catches them at the right angle, they carry a faint luminosity, not bright, but present, the kind of quality that makes a thing look slightly more alive than its surroundings. A single egg sac may hold anywhere from a handful to several hundred eggs, depending on the species. The number varies more than most people would guess. Some of the smaller spider species, whose bodies are barely a few millimeters long, produce sacs containing only a few eggs, 5, 10, sometimes fewer. A garden orb weaver, working at the larger end of the common spider range, may enclose several hundred eggs in a single sac, each one contributing to a total that, if the season goes well, will produce a significant number of spiderlings in the spring. The larger species, the ones whose leg spans reach several centimeters, are capable of producing egg sacs holding more than 1,000 eggs, though the precise number varies across individuals and across seasons, depending on the resources the female has accumulated. The range is simply enormous. The word a spider's egg sac covers biological realities that differ from one another by a factor of 100 or more, depending on which spider is doing the laying and in what conditions. Size is the first thing to settle clearly in mind when thinking about any of this. Each individual spider egg is in most species less than 2 millimeters across. Many are closer to 1 millimeter. At 1 millimeter, a sphere is slightly smaller than the period at the end of a printed sentence, visible but only just, and easily missed against any background that does not provide strong contrast. The eggs of smaller species may be smaller still. When a naturalist or a biologist describes examining spider eggs with any precision, they are describing work that requires at least a hand lens, and more often a microscope or a loupe of significant magnification, because the things being examined are not easily held in comfortable visual focus by the naked eye alone. They are there, they are real, and specific and patterned, but they occupy a scale that asks for patience and for equipment before they can be seen with any clarity. Against a pale background under a hand lens, a cluster of spider eggs resolves into something quietly beautiful. The spheres are arranged in close contact with one another, each touching several of its neighbors. Their smooth surfaces creating a pattern of gentle curves and shallow negative spaces between them. In most species, the color falls within a range from white to cream to very pale yellow, with some species producing eggs of a slightly warmer tone that moves toward the palest possible amber or the faintest imaginable pink. The colors are never strong, and they are the colors of things held in sheltered darkness, of things that have not been shaped by the need to display, or warn, or attract, but simply to exist undisturbed through the weeks of their development. The female continues wrapping. Once the eggs are laid against the silk mat, the real construction of the sac begins, and this is the phase that takes the most time. She moves in repetitive arcs, drawing silk from her spinnerets and pressing it down over the surface of the egg cluster in overlapping layers that gradually thicken the walls of the sac from a few threads to a structure with real physical substance. The layers accumulate. The outermost surface of the completed sac is often visibly different from the threads inside, coarser, more textured, sometimes incorporating debris from the environment, sometimes bearing a distinct weave pattern that differs from the inner lining. In some species, the outer layer is loose and irregular, giving the completed sac a slightly rough, papery quality. In others, it is smoother and more uniform. The variation is real and consistent enough that a person familiar with spider egg sacs can sometimes identify the producing species from the structure of the sac alone without seeing the spider itself. There is a useful comparison available here, though it requires setting the familiar image aside in favor of something more precise. An egg sac is not the same shape or texture as what most people picture when they imagine a cocoon. It is not typically elongated or pointed. Most spider egg sacs are roughly spherical or slightly flattened, like a small compressed ball, and their diameter when complete is usually somewhere between the size of a large pea and the size of a small grape, depending on the species and the number of eggs enclosed. The walls are dense enough to hold their shape under gentle handling, but they are not rigid. They have the give of tightly woven fabric rather than anything that might be described as hard or stiff. They can be deformed by sustained pressure. They are not designed to resist force. They are designed to resist dryness and cold and the small incidental disturbances of the environment in which they will spend the weeks ahead. What the silk offers the eggs is, above almost everything else, protection from moisture loss. Spider eggs outside of their sac are vulnerable to desiccation in a way that limits how long they can remain viable in open air. The silken enclosure slows the transfer of moisture from the eggs to the surrounding environment, maintaining a more stable internal humidity through the fluctuations of temperature and air movement that the exterior of the sac experiences freely. The inner lining in particular, that fine, close-woven layer that makes direct contact with the egg cluster, appears to be selected for this property, its density and texture working together to create a microenvironment that the eggs alone could not maintain. In some species, the silk of the inner lining also carries low concentrations of antimicrobial compounds, substances produced by the spider that appear to inhibit the growth of fungi and bacteria in the enclosed space. The mechanism is not fully understood in all species, and the presence and effectiveness of these compounds varies across the broader spider family, but the pattern has been documented consistently enough to suggest that the egg sac is not simply a physical barrier, it is also, in a limited chemical sense, a managed environment. This is, when held at a slight distance, a quiet and genuinely interesting thing, a spider which has no hands, no tools, No instruction and no experience of having done this before in the case of a first-time layer produces in the space of a few hours a multi-layered structure made from a material she synthesizes internally, sized and shaped to contain a specific number of fragile biological objects, equipped with properties that buffer the enclosed space against the most common threats to the egg's survival, and in some species chemically treated against biological contamination. She does not know she is doing any of this in the sense that knowledge might be described in any organism with a larger brain. The behavior is encoded in structures she carries and expresses in sequence when the conditions and her own internal biology align. The result is still there in the morning, a small sealed, pale-walled chamber hanging in the corner of the shed or pressed against the back surface of a leaf, holding its contents against the weather, doing what it was built to do. An orb weaver working in late summer will typically produce her sack toward dusk. The timing is worth pausing on. The long late season evenings, the particular humidity of the hours after the sun has gone, the relative quiet of that time of day. These conditions coincide reliably with egg sac construction across a wide range of species, suggesting that the behavior is regulated in part by light and temperature cues that are consistent enough across the species range to have been incorporated into the behavioral sequence over evolutionary time. She chooses a location that offers shelter from direct precipitation and from the most direct sunlight, often in a crevice or beneath an overhang or on the underside of a surface that gives the sac a degree of protection from above. When she is finished, she may remain near the sac, guarding it in the literal physical sense, sitting on or near it, and responding to disturbance with a defensiveness she does not otherwise show toward her surroundings. Other species simply leave. The investment is complete. The sac holds what it was built to hold, and the rest is time. The silk used to make the egg sac is a material worth pausing over in its own right, apart from the sac itself, because the general category of spider silk tends to be described in ways that flatten its considerable variety. The dragline thread that a spider uses to move, the safety line she drops from, the main structural cable of a web, is a different material from the spiral capture threads that actually catch prey, which are in turn different from the threads she uses to wrap prey, which differ again from the material of the egg sac. These are not variations on a single substance. They are distinct proteins produced by distinct glands, and their properties differ in ways that reflect the different mechanical demands of each use. Dragline silk combines tensile strength and elasticity in a ratio that has interested materials scientists for decades. It can stretch considerably before it breaks and then return close to its original length, a combination of properties that no current synthetic material quite matches. Capture spiral silk is coated with hygroscopic compounds that keep it sticky in humid air and contribute to its elasticity. The silk of the egg sac is less elastic than either of these, more closely woven, denser, and selected more for insulation than for mechanical performance. A completed egg sac resting on a shelf in the corner of a garden shed occupies a space that most people would walk past without registering. It does not advertise itself. Its color is close to that of the surrounding dust and dried plant matter. Its size makes it easy to overlook, even when a person is looking directly at the surface it occupies. The outer layer may be slightly roughened by attached particles of wood fiber or dried leaf material, and this surface texture, combined with the pale and unremarkable color, makes the sac exceptionally easy to miss in any environment that is not completely bare. A person who has found one and looked at it closely will report that it is smaller than they expected and lighter, and that it has the quality of something carefully made, not in the way a manufactured object has, with its uniformity and precision, but in the way that a bird's nest has, and with its evident responsiveness to the materials available and the particular requirements of the task. Inside that sack, undisturbed, the eggs are waiting. That phrase, the eggs are waiting, is not quite accurate because it implies a kind of active expectancy that eggs do not experience. What is closer to accurate is simply that a biological process is underway, that the development that began at fertilization is continuing in the warm, humid, dark interior of the sac, and that the conditions the sac maintains are the conditions that allow that process to proceed. The eggs are not aware of anything. They are not quiet in the way a listening creature is quiet. They are still in the way that a river is still, when observed from far enough away that its motion becomes invisible. The stillness is a matter of scale and distance, not of the absence of process. The eggs of an American house spider are among the smallest in the range of common North American species, and a house spider egg sac may hold somewhere between 20 and several hundred eggs, depending on the age and condition of the female, enclosed in a sac that is roughly the size of a small button and has the color of old ivory. The female American house spider typically produces multiple sacs across the course of her adult life, suspending them in the tangled webs she builds in the low corners of rooms and in the dark spaces behind furniture and along baseboards. She stays near them. She does not patrol them or rearrange them. She simply remains present, resting near the sacs in the irregular web she has built, waiting out the weeks of development in the same unremarkable patience with which she built the sac in the first place. The particular quality of that patience is not something that can be easily pressed into more dramatic language without becoming false. A house spider in a quiet room in the early evening, sitting near the eggs she has laid, is not doing anything that demands description in terms other than what it is, a small creature doing the thing her species has done in this way for longer than the rooms she lives in have existed. The web in the corner is not impressive by any aesthetic standard. The spider herself is less than a centimeter long, her body a dull brown, her legs fine and slightly translucent near the tips. The sac she is guarding is paler than the web, slightly more opaque, a small roundish shape that the web holds loosely suspended a centimeter or two from the nearest wall. Nothing about the scene asks for attention. It simply persists in the quiet of the room, entirely self-sufficient and requiring nothing from anyone passing through. Spiders have been laying eggs and sealing them into silken sacs for a very long time. The fossil record for spider egg sacs is limited by the usual difficulty of preserving soft biological structures across geological time, but spiders themselves appear in the fossil record from at least the Carboniferous period, and the basic architecture of the egg sac appears to be an ancient feature of the group, present across so many of the approximately 45,000 known living species that it can reasonably be described as one of the defining characteristics of the order. In that span of time, the egg sac has been produced in deserts and in tropical rainforests, in the spaces beneath Arctic rocks, and in the heated corners of basements in northern cities, in the bark crevices of trees in temperate forests, and in the leaf litter of forest floors, and in the tight architectural spaces of buildings that have only existed for a century or two. The egg sac adapts in its details, its size, its construction time, the number of eggs it encloses, the degree to which it is guarded, but its essential form and function remain consistent across these enormously varied circumstances. A spider, after all, is not a large animal. The giant huntsman spider, with a leg span that can reach 30 centimeters, holds the record among living species for total leg span, and even that animal's body, its actual torso, fits comfortably within a human hand. Most spiders are considerably smaller. The ones most people encounter in their homes and gardens and sheds range from a few millimeters to perhaps 2 centimeters in total body length, most of them well under 1 centimeter, most of them doing nothing in the course of their lives that a person paying attention would need to qualify as either remarkable or threatening. They occupy the small spaces. They manage with silken patience the challenges of an existence conducted at a scale where a water droplet is an obstacle and a crack in a baseboard is a landscape. Their eggs reflect this scale exactly, each one barely visible, each sac barely the size of a button. The whole enterprise of their reproduction conducted in corners and under leaves and in the shaded underside of garden furniture, away from the attention of anything larger. In a garden in late August, on the underside of a broad leaf, somewhere near the base of a fence, a female spider is finishing the outer layer of an egg sac she began at dusk. Her movements have slowed slightly in the hours since she started. The sac is nearly complete, the outer surface nearly covered, the layers dense enough now to hold the enclosed eggs through the weeks of autumn ahead. She moves over the surface of the sac in a slow rotation, pressing new silk against the existing layers, checking with her legs for gaps or thin places, adding material where the coverage seems insufficient. She is not checking consciously in any sense that involves a plan or a memory of what she was trying to do. She is responding to contact and to the particular resistance of the surface under her legs, and the behavior her nervous system produces in response to that information is the behavior that completes the sac. It is enough. It has always been enough. The sac she will have finished by the time the first light appears above the fence will hold its contents through the first frosts and into the winter, and what it holds, each small pale sphere barely a millimeter across, smooth and faintly luminous, and smaller than almost anyone would imagine, will continue its slow, quiet biological process in the dark and the warmth of the sealed silk walls, entirely undisturbed and waiting for the spring to come. The eggs themselves are, in that stillness, exactly what they are: small, pale, fragile things, not much larger than the period at the end of a sentence, held in a structure their mother built, with the precision of an animal that has been doing this for a very long time. The rumor that surrounded them in the broader world outside the shed made them into something larger and more threatening than they actually are, transported them in imagination into impossible places and improbable contexts. The reality they inhabit is quieter and more specific, and in its own way more interesting than anything the rumor claimed. 2 millimeters across, smooth-surfaced, pale as cream, held in a silken room barely larger than a pea, resting in the corner of a garden shed in the long, slow dark of early autumn. That is what spider eggs actually are, and the gap between that small and fragile truth and the story that circulated around it is, when held calmly at the right distance, one of the more quietly illuminating distances in the whole history of what people have believed about the things they eat. The raw gum base arrives at the kettle as a solid block, pale and dense, and for a few minutes after it is lowered in, nothing appears to happen. The heat works from the outside in. The edges soften first, losing their sharp angles, taking on a slight translucence, and then slowly, over the course of the next several minutes, the whole mass begins to yield to the warmth around it and to release itself into something thicker, slower, and more compliant than it was. The interior of the kettle is wide, and the paddles that move through it are built for this, for the resistance of material that has not yet decided to become what it is going to be. By the time the temperature inside the kettle reaches somewhere between 60 and 100 degrees Celsius, the gum base has become a warm, dense, slowly churning mass that catches the light in a pale, slightly glossy way as it folds over itself in long, heavy movements. This is the beginning of bubblegum. Not the pink, not the flavor, not the wrapper or the brand name. Those come later, and each of them arrives at its own stage and in its own precise order. What begins in the kettle is the structural foundation of the finished product, the part that gives gum its specific character, its capacity to be chewed without dissolving, its ability to hold a shape and then release it, its particular resistance and give. The gum base that goes into the kettle is a formulation of synthetic polymers, polyisobutylene and polyvinyl acetate among them, and these are not food ingredients in any intuitive sense. They are not grown, harvested, or extracted from something recognizable. They are manufactured compounds selected for specific physical properties, combined in precise ratios, and processed under controlled conditions that leave very little room for variation. The factory where this happens is not a place that resembles a kitchen. It does not resemble anything domestic. It is a large, organized, brightly lit industrial space where the scale of everything takes a moment to absorb. The size of the kettles, the length of the conveyor lines, the number of processes running in sequence without pause, the number of people in white coats and hairnets moving between stations with the practiced attention of people who have done this many times and know exactly what they are watching for. The air carries a warmth from the machinery and a faint synthetic sweetness that is not quite identifiable as any single flavor, more like the idea of sweetness before it has been given a specific form. Everything in the facility exists in relation to everything else, each stage feeding into the next in a sequence that has been designed and refined over many production runs, adjusted when something did not work as expected, and then adjusted again until the output came out right every time. It is worth holding that image clearly, the kettle, the heat, the slow churning material, because the question of what could survive in that environment is not a complicated one. The temperatures involved in gum base melting are not extreme by industrial standards, but they are well beyond what any biological structure could endure. Proteins denature, cell walls rupture. Whatever was once organized and living becomes, under sustained heat of that range, something entirely different from what it was. This is not a special feature of the bubblegum process. It is simply what heat does to biological material at those temperatures, in the same way that heat does it in an oven, in a pot of water brought to a boil, in any context where sustained warmth meets the specific molecular structures that make living things what they are. The gum base, once fully melted and moving smoothly through the kettle, does not simply sit there waiting for the next step. The paddles keep working. The blending continues. Sweeteners are added in a sequence: corn syrup, dextrose, powdered sugar, each one introduced at the point in the process where it will combine most effectively with the material already in the kettle. Softening agents follow, and then the flavorings, and with each addition the mixture changes in small specific ways that the people monitoring the process are trained to observe. The color of the mass changes, the consistency changes, the rate at which it moves through the kettle changes. All of these are data points, all of them are watched, and all of them have target values that the finished batch must meet before it moves to the next stage. Bubble Yum was developed by Lifesavers Inc., the candy company founded by Clarence Crane in 1913, and the specific character that made it novel, that unusual softness, that quality of yielding to a thumb pressed gently into its surface in a way that older gums simply did not, came not from any strange or mysterious ingredient, but from the particular formulation of synthetic polymers and softening agents in its gum base. The softness was an engineering outcome. It was the result of decisions made about ratios and compounds during the development process, tested, adjusted, tested again, and eventually arrived at as the formulation that produced the texture the product was meant to have. There was nothing accidental about it. There was nothing unexplained. The softness that made children press their thumbs curiously into a fresh piece, that made the gum feel different from anything they had chewed before, was designed to feel exactly that way. Once the blended mass reaches the right consistency and the quality checks at the kettle stage have been satisfied, it moves into the extrusion process. Extrusion is the stage where the formless, warm, churning mixture is pushed through a die, a shaped opening, to emerge as a continuous rope of material with a consistent cross-section. The extruder is a machine built to apply significant, sustained mechanical force. It pushes the gum mass through the die under considerable pressure, and the material that comes out the other side is not the same structurally as the material that went in. The mechanical shear forces involved in extrusion, the combination of pressure, movement, and the specific geometry of the die act on the material in ways that uniformly combine its components while also subjecting the mass to physical stresses that would not leave delicate structures intact. A biological structure introduced anywhere in the mixture before this stage, any small, fragile, organic object, would not pass through extrusion in recognizable form. The forces are not selective. They act on everything present in the mass. The rope of gum that emerges from the extruder is warm and slightly soft, and it travels along a conveyor belt through a temperature-controlled room where it gradually cools and firms as it moves. The conveyor is long. The room is kept at a specific temperature. The rate at which the rope cools determines something about the finished texture of the gum, and so the conditions in this room are maintained with attention. Workers in this section of the facility watch the rope as it moves, noting any irregularities in diameter, any deviation in surface texture, any color that doesn't match what the batch should look like at this stage. The rope moves steadily, the same width all along its length, the same pale color, the same surface quality, from one end of the room to the other. There is something almost meditative about it, viewed from a comfortable distance, the continuous emergence of material from the machine, its long, unhurried transit along the belt, the gradual transition from warm and pliable to cooled and firm as it approaches the far end. At the cutting station, the rope is divided into pieces. The machinery does this with precision, the same length each time, the same weight each time, adjusted to the specifications for the particular format of the finished product. Pieces meant to become the rectangular sticks that go into a standard Bubblegum package are cut to one set of dimensions. Different formats require different cuts. The cutting machinery operates quickly and consistently, and the pieces that come off the line are, from this point forward, the individual units that will eventually reach a wrapper, and then a package, and then a shelf. Each piece is already, in its basic form, the gum that will be chewed. What remains is enclosure and labeling and packaging, the stages that take a thing that is already what it is and prepare it for the world outside the facility. The United States Food and Drug Administration regulates chewing gum under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and the requirements that apply to chewing gum manufacturers are not a general set of suggestions. They are specific mandated standards, current good manufacturing practice standards, that cover facility sanitation, equipment design, employee hygiene, pest control, and contamination prevention at every stage of production. These standards exist because food manufacturing happens at scale, because the number of individual units produced in any given production run is very large, and because the consequences of a failure in contamination prevention at any point in a large-scale process are correspondingly large. The regulatory framework is built around the understanding that individual vigilance is not sufficient at industrial scale, that the systems surrounding individual workers must themselves be designed to prevent the failures that individual attention alone cannot catch. A food manufacturing facility operating under these standards is not simply a clean building with attentive staff. It is a physical environment that has been designed from the ground up with contamination prevention as one of its central engineering problems. The surfaces and production areas are selected for cleanability. The equipment is designed without internal cavities or joints that could harbor residue. The flow of people and materials through the facility is managed to prevent cross-contamination between different stages of production. Pest control is not a reactive program. It is a continuous, documented, inspection-based system that monitors for evidence of pest activity and addresses any sign of it before it becomes a problem. Employee hygiene requirements, the coats, the hairnets, the gloves, the specific protocols around hand washing and the handling of food contact surfaces are not symbolic. They are part of a layered system in which each requirement addresses a specific contamination pathway. Within that broader system, modern food manufacturing facilities also run specific detection technologies designed to identify foreign material that has somehow entered the production stream. Metal detectors are standard. X-ray inspection systems are increasingly common. Sieving and filtration equipment removes particles that fall outside acceptable size ranges at the stages of production where ingredients are introduced or mixed. Optical sorting systems, cameras and sensors that inspect product surfaces in real time as they move along the line can identify and remove units that deviate from expected appearance parameters, sometimes at resolutions finer than a fraction of a millimeter. These systems do not operate independently of each other. They overlap. A particle that passes one detection method is likely to encounter another further along the line. The philosophy underlying this approach is not that any single system is perfect, but that the probability of a contaminant passing through multiple independent systems undetected is in practical terms very low. It is useful to think about what any foreign biological material would actually have to survive to make it from the outside world into a finished package of bubblegum. It would have to enter the facility at all against a continuous pest control program designed to prevent exactly that. It would have to survive the temperatures in the melting kettle, temperatures that climb and hold well above what any unprotected biological material can endure. It would have to survive the mechanical forces of blending and extrusion without being physically disrupted. It would have to evade the detection systems operating continuously along the production line, and then it would have to end up not merely in the finished gum mass, but in a specific piece of gum, in quantities meaningful enough to be perceivable by a child who unwrapped and chewed that piece, and do all of this without triggering any of the quality control checks that operate at the batch level, catching deviations in color, texture, or consistency before the product moves forward. Every one of these is a separate obstacle. They are not sequential hurdles, where clearing one makes the next easier. Each one is independent, and each one must be passed. The warm mass in the kettle does not know any of this, of course. It churns and folds as the paddles move through it, and the people monitoring the batch note the time and the temperature and the visual state of the material, and outside the facility, a whole other world continues its business, entirely unaware of what is happening inside. The 1970s, when bubble yum was new, was a different era of manufacturing in many specific ways. The inspection technology was different. The regulatory framework had developed less far. The detection systems that are now standard were not yet standard. This is true. A candy factory in 1977 was not the same physical environment as a candy factory today. And yet, even then, the basic physical conditions of the process, the heat, the mechanical processing, the scale and organization of industrial food production were not compatible with the central claim of the spider egg rumor. The claim was not that contamination was theoretically possible. The claim was that it was happening, that it was common enough that a specific child, somewhere, had found specific eggs or baby spiders in a specific piece of gum. The specific softness of bubble yum, the detail that seemed to require explanation, that felt to children in 1977 like a sensory puzzle, something not quite accounted for by anything they knew about gum, had a complete and specific answer in the chemistry of the gum base formulation. When bubble yum first appeared on shelves, the information about what made it soft was not widely available to the public in a form that felt satisfying. The wrapper did not explain it in terms that resolved the question the texture raised. The product was soft, noticeably and unusually soft, and the explanation for that softness was not immediately legible in the way that the softness itself was. That gap between the felt reality of the texture and the absence of an immediately available explanation for it was exactly the kind of space that a rumor moves into. Not because people are credulous, not because they are foolish, but because an unexplained thing has a quality that draws toward it, the stories that seem to fill the space it leaves open. What filled the space, in this case, was spider eggs. The story was not random, it was a particular answer to a particular puzzle, one that explained the soft, slightly yielding quality of the gum in terms of something that children knew to be real, something that carried the right texture of plausibility while remaining just beyond easy verification. And once the story was in circulation, it became its own evidence. A child who had heard it would press her thumb into the surface of a piece of bubble yum and feel the softness and find that the softness confirmed what she had been told, because the softness was real, and the story had given her a framework for interpreting it, and frameworks, once in place, are not easily dislodged by pointing at the factory. The gum itself, meanwhile, continued to be made in exactly the same way. The kettles continued to melt the gum base at exactly the temperatures they had always used. The extruders continued to push the mass through the die under exactly the pressure they had always applied. The conveyors continued to carry the rope of cooling gum through the temperature-controlled room at exactly the rate they had always moved. The workers in the facility continued to do the work they had always done, in the way they had always done it, and the finished product that came off the line at the end of each production run continued to be exactly what it had always been, a piece of soft pink bubblegum in a sealed wrapper, its texture the result of a specific gum base formulation, its color the result of a specific flavoring and coloring agent, its flavor the result of a specific blend of compounds added in a specific sequence at a specific point in the blending process. Quality assurance in a food manufacturing facility of this kind is not a final stage activity, something performed at the end of the line to catch problems before they leave the building. It runs continuously throughout the process. A technician in a white coat and hairnet holds a small sample of gum base at the kettle stage and examines it against the specification for that batch, the right color, the right consistency, the right temperature. Further along the line, Another technician takes a sample from the extruded rope and checks its dimensions against the target values. At the packaging stage, finished units are periodically pulled from the line and examined, weighed, measured, inspected visually for anything that deviates from what the product is supposed to look like. The records of all of these checks are kept. The process is documented not because documentation is pleasant, but because documentation is the mechanism by which deviations are caught, traced, and corrected, and because the regulatory requirements that govern the facility demand it. None of this was invented to address the spider egg rumor. All of it existed for reasons entirely unrelated to any specific legend or public concern. It existed because it was the appropriate way to run a food manufacturing facility at industrial scale, and because the consequences of failing to do it were business consequences, regulatory consequences, and consequences for the people who consumed the product. The systems that make the central claim of the spider egg rumor physically impossible were not built to make that particular claim impossible. They were built because they were the right systems for the task, and the impossibility of the claim is simply a consequence of their existence. A row of bubblegum packages on a packaging line moves with a steady, even rhythm, each package emerging sealed and printed from the machine, each one taking its place in a clear plastic bin at the end of the belt in a succession that has the quality of something well settled, something that has found its pace and sees no reason to deviate from it. The packages are small and bright. Their wrappers carry the name of the product in the colors that the brand used, and inside each wrapper, the pieces of gum are arranged in the order they were placed there by the packaging machinery, each piece the same weight and the same dimensions as the ones beside it. The bin fills slowly. When it is full, someone removes it and replaces it with an empty one, and the packages continue to come off the line without pause. The production run for a batch of bubblegum is not a brief event. It takes time. During that time, the kettles run, the extruders run, the conveyors run, the detection systems run, and the workers move between their stations and watch the process and note any deviations and do what the process requires them to do. The facility is not dramatic. It is organized. It runs at a level of sustained, unhurried attention that is the characteristic quality of a large, orderly industrial process. Not exciting in the way that the word exciting is commonly used, but satisfying in the way that watching any well-designed system perform its function correctly, hour after hour, tends to be satisfying when observed from a comfortable distance. The gum that comes off the line at the end of a production run is the same as the gum that came off the line at the beginning, and the same as the gum that will come off the line tomorrow. Its softness will be the same, its color will be the same, its flavor will be the same. The specific combination of synthetic polymers and softening agents that gives it its characteristic texture will have been present in exactly the same ratio it was present in the batch before, because the formulation is a fixed thing, a solved equation, a set of numbers that were arrived at during product development and have not changed because changing them would change the product. The gum is soft because it was designed to be soft. It was designed to be soft because softness was a desirable property in the format it was made to occupy. A large pillow-like piece meant to be chewed without effort and to produce a bubble of a specific size and stability. The softness is not mysterious. It is an outcome. At the end of a production run, when the last batch has been packaged and the bins have been taken away, and the packaging line has been shut down in its proper sequence, the facility moves into its cleaning cycle. The equipment is broken down to the extent that cleaning protocols require. The surfaces are scrubbed, the machinery is washed with the cleaning agents, and at the concentrations and contact times specified in the sanitation program. The floor is scrubbed, the drains are cleaned, the corners and edges of the room receive the specific attention that corners and edges require because residue accumulates in corners and edges, and residue is a contamination risk. When the cleaning cycle is complete, the facility is inspected. The equipment gleams under the bright overhead lights. The floor is clean and dry. The air carries a faint synthetic sweetness that is, by this point in the evening, less the smell of the product being made, and more the ambient character of a space where this work is done regularly, something that has settled into the walls and the air without being unpleasant, simply present, the particular smell of a particular kind of place. The night shift in facilities that run continuously begins their work in this cleaned and inspected space. The kettles are brought back to temperature. The gum base goes in. The paddles begin to move. The process starts again from the beginning, in the same order, following the same sequence, producing the same product. Outside the facility, the streets of whatever city or town surrounds it are quiet in the hours before morning, and the lights of the factory are visible from a distance in the dark. A set of illuminated windows in a building that from the outside gives almost no indication of what is happening within. A passing car might see the lights and register a building and continue past. The driver would have no particular reason to think about what was being made inside, or how, or what the history of that product was in terms of the stories that had been told about it. Inside, the kettle is warm, the gum base is softening, and the process is, once again, exactly what it has always been, a sequence of controlled, documented, inspected steps that take a set of specific ingredients and produce from them a specific finished product. The pink color that will be added at the blending stage is waiting in its container. The flavoring is measured and ready. The packaging materials are loaded into the machine. Everything is in the place it is supposed to be, because everything in this facility is always in the place it is supposed to be, and the product that will come off the line in several hours will be sealed and labeled and placed in a box and sent to a warehouse, and from there to a truck, and from there to a store, and from there to a shelf, from there to the hand of a child who will unwrap it and press a thumb into its surface to feel how soft it is, and chew it and find that it tastes exactly like what it is. A finished package of Bubblegum on a conveyor belt moves toward the waiting box with the particular quality of something that has completed all the stages it needed to complete. The mixing, the processing, the cutting, the wrapping, the sealing, the printing, and arrived at the end of its manufacturing life as the thing it was always going to be. The package is sealed. Its contents are what its label says they are. The process that produced it was documented and inspected and checked at multiple points along the way, and the product that emerged from that process is in every relevant sense exactly what it appears to be. It moves along the belt in a steady succession with the packages before it and the packages behind it, each one the same, each one complete, each one traveling toward the same quiet destination, a box, a warehouse, a shelf, a wrapper carefully unpeeled by a child who does not know anything about kettles or extruders or quality assurance technicians, who only knows that the gum is soft and pink and sweet, and that this, for the moment, is entirely enough. The belt carries it forward. The room is bright and orderly and warm. Outside, the world continues its business. Inside, the process runs, as it has always run, turning its materials into its product with the calm, unhurried competence of a system that has been doing this for a very long time, and expects without drama to continue doing it for a very long time more. A glass of juice sits on a table in a research room somewhere in the mid 1980s. The juice is apple, pale gold, poured into a clean glass. A woman sits across from it with her hands folded in her lap, and she is not drinking it. A researcher has just told her, calmly and clearly, that a sterilized object, clean, treated, entirely harmless by every chemical and biological measure available, has briefly touched the surface of the liquid. The juice has not changed. Its color is the same. Its smell is the same. No residue remains. The woman knows all of this. She has been told all of this. And still her hands remain folded in her lap, and she is not drinking it. This is not a story about irrationality. It is a story about a system working exactly as it was built to work, a system older than language, older than the concept of food safety, older than anything that could be called a considered opinion about what is and is not dangerous to consume. The woman at the table is not foolish. She is, in the most precise sense, human. What is happening in her body at that moment, as she looks at the glass and does not reach for it, is one of the more carefully documented and consistently replicated findings in the psychology of disgust. And it begins with a principle that a researcher named Paul Rosen spent much of his career mapping from the inside. Rosen called it the law of contagion. The principle holds that once a contaminating object has made contact with a food, even briefly, even without leaving any detectable physical trace, even when the subject has been clearly informed that the contact was clean and harmless, the food is experienced as permanently altered, not intellectually. The subjects in Rosen's studies understood perfectly well what they had been told. The alteration was felt rather than reasoned, arriving below the level of deliberate thought, in a part of the mind that does not weigh evidence or update on new information in the way a person composing a careful argument might. The contamination was imagined, the response was not. Rosen ran variations of this experiment across many years, adjusting the details to probe the precise shape of the response. He asked subjects to drink juice after a sterilized dead cockroach had been dipped into it and removed. He asked subjects to eat fudge molded into the shape of dog feces. He asked subjects to eat soup that had been stirred with a new clean fly swatter still in its packaging. In every case, the rational mind and the emotional one arrived at different conclusions about the same object, and the emotional conclusion was the one that governed behavior. The glass stayed on the table. The fudge went uneaten. The juice remained untouched. And across thousands of subjects, the results were consistent enough that the response began to look less like an individual idiosyncrasy and more like a feature of the architecture. What Rosen was documenting in that quiet research room with its pale gold glass of juice was a cognitive system that operates on the logic of the worst case. If an object might be contaminated, the system treats it as contaminated. If contact has occurred, the system treats the food as changed. The cost of a false positive, throwing away perfectly safe food, is low. The cost of a false negative, eating something genuinely harmful, can be fatal. Over a long enough time scale, in an environment where the sources of contamination were genuinely difficult to assess and the consequences of error were severe, a system that erred consistently on the side of rejection would have conferred real advantages. The woman with her hands folded in her lap is not being irrational. She is running a very old calculation correctly. A piece of bubblegum in the hands of a child in 1977 who has just heard what a classmate said at lunch is a version of that glass. The gum has not changed. It is exactly what it was an hour ago. Its ingredients are the same. Its color is the same pale pink. Its texture is the same unusual softness that made it interesting in the first place. But the child holds it slightly away from her face now, looking at it differently, her expression caught somewhere between appetite and the thought she cannot quite set aside. The gum is unchanged. Her feeling about it has shifted entirely, and the mechanism responsible for that shift is not a flaw in her reasoning. It is a very effective system doing its job. Cross-cultural research on disgust has consistently found that spiders rank particularly high on disgust responses, and this holds even in populations where fear of spiders is not especially prevalent, even among people who would not describe themselves as bothered by spiders in any significant way. They know, on reflection, that most spiders are harmless. They are not alarmed when one appears in a garden, but ask them to imagine spider matter inside something they are about to eat, and the disgust response arrives promptly and strongly in a way that is difficult to reason past. Evolutionary psychologists have proposed that this reflects something accumulated across a long period of human history, during which certain arthropods were genuinely dangerous, and the cost of treating them all as potentially harmful was modest compared to the cost of treating a dangerous one as safe. Spiders, specifically, carry a particular weight in this calculus. They are associated in many people's minds not just with their bite, but with something more ambient, with encroachment, with hidden presence, with the particular unease of an encounter in an enclosed or intimate space. They appear in dark corners of familiar places. They are small enough to go unnoticed until they are close. Their egg sacs are objects that most people encounter only accidentally, unexpectedly, in spaces they thought they knew. All of these associations compound. When a rumor arrives that places a spider egg, that specific, hidden, biologically freighted object, inside the intimate space of food already in the mouth, it is not arriving into a neutral psychological environment. It is arriving into a space that has been for a very long time prepared to receive it. The anterior insula is a region of the brain folded into the lateral surface of the cerebral cortex, not visible from the outside, sitting at the intersection of sensory processing and emotional response. Neuroimaging studies have identified it as the primary region activated during disgust, the area that lights up when a subject encounters something perceived as biologically contaminating or physically revolting. What those studies have also found, and what matters particularly for understanding how a rumor about spider eggs in bubblegum could spread so efficiently through a school, is that verbal descriptions of contamination activate the anterior insula with a speed and intensity comparable to direct sensory encounters with the disgusting object itself. The body does not wait for the rational mind to finish its assessment. The feeling of revulsion arrives first, fast and strong, before the deliberate thinking has had time to evaluate whether the described contamination is real or imagined, likely or impossible, specific or vague. This means that a child sitting at a lunch table, being told in quiet detail what a classmate's older brother supposedly found inside a piece of bubble yum, is not simply receiving a piece of information to be evaluated. She is having a physical experience. Her anterior insula is activating. Her body is responding to the description as though the contamination were present in front of her, not merely described in words. By the time the rational part of her mind might begin to form the question of whether this is actually true, the feeling has already arrived. And the feeling, as Rohn's research makes clear, is not easily overwritten by subsequent information. The juice stays on the table. The gum is held slightly away from the face. The feeling persists. There is a particular phrase that appears in accounts of how this and similar rumors spread through school populations, and it is worth pausing on it because its structure tells something important. The phrase is, someone I know, a cousin, a friend's older sister, a boy from another school whose mother was a nurse. The rumor almost never arrives in the first person. The child passing it on has rarely, if ever, claimed to have found the eggs herself. It arrives via a chain of personal relationship, each link in the chain lending the claim a borrowed authority it would not have if it arrived from a stranger or from a printed source. Someone I know found it. Someone I trust told me. The specific combination of personal relationship and claimed direct experience is, it turns out, one of the most effective delivery mechanisms a false belief can have, because it bypasses the skepticism that an abstract claim from an unknown source might encounter. People are not, in general, in the habit of doubting people they trust about matters those people claim to have witnessed directly. Jan Harold Brynvand, a folklorist who spent decades collecting and categorizing American urban legends, found that food contamination myths form a remarkably consistent category. The stories share a template that appears so reliably across different times, places, products, and supposed contaminants that it begins to look like a genre with its own rules. A trusted commercial product, a hidden biological contaminant, a warning transmitted through personal relationships, with each transmission reinforcing its credibility by adding the authority of the person passing it along. Brynvand documented dozens of variations on this structure, and what he found each time was the same basic architecture, the familiar and trusted thing suddenly revealed to contain something wrong, the warning arriving not from an institution or an expert, but from someone who knows someone who was there. His book on the subject, published in 1981, laid out the pattern clearly. Food contamination legends were not random. They did not attach themselves arbitrarily to whatever product happened to be popular. They attached themselves to specific products at specific moments, to products that were new enough to be unfamiliar, popular enough to be widely consumed, and manufactured in processes that were distant enough from the consumer's direct experience that no one could simply walk into a kitchen and verify the claim for themselves. The industrial food system, which had expanded enormously in the post-war decades, produced exactly this condition at scale. Millions of people consuming millions of products whose actual origins they had no way to observe. In that gap between consumption and production, between the mouth and the factory floor, rumor found its natural habitat. Bubblegum arrived in 1977 in a state of almost unprecedented sudden popularity. Children across the country were buying it in quantities that surprised even its manufacturers. It was soft in a way that no gum had been soft before, yielding under the thumb in a way that the harder gums, the bazooka and the double bubble did not. That softness was new. It was unexplained in the experience of anyone chewing it. Children did not know what made it soft, what had been added or changed or removed to produce that texture, and the industrial process that had created it was entirely invisible to them. The question of what made bubblegum different from every other gum had no accessible answer. The rumor, in a sense, provided one. The folklorist Gary Allen Fine, whose work on this particular legend is among the most detailed available, has described it as benefiting from what he called legend-friendly timing. The gum had become so popular so quickly that it occupied a kind of cultural prominence that made it a natural target for the kind of skeptical second-guessing that very successful things often attract. Something that good, that popular, that new, surely there must be something wrong with it. The success of the product created the conditions for the suspicion, and the suspicion arrived in the most believable form possible, not as an abstract concern about industrial food production, but as a specific story about something someone's cousin had found inside a specific piece of gum. Developmental psychologists have found that disgust sensitivity follows a particular arc across childhood and adolescence. It is not constant. It does not arrive fully formed at birth and remain stable throughout life. It increases significantly during middle childhood, roughly the years from 7 to 10, and reaches its peak in early adolescence, the years from 11 to 14 or so. This is not a coincidence or an accident of timing. It appears to reflect a developmental process in which the child is acquiring the social and biological knowledge that makes disgust responses functional, learning what is clean and unclean, what is safe and unsafe, what belongs in the mouth and what does not. The system is, in a sense, coming online during exactly those years. And those years, middle childhood through early adolescence, are precisely the years during which children were the primary consumers of products like Bubblegum, and the primary vectors through which the spider egg rumor traveled. A child of 8 or 10 or 12 is, according to this research, at the developmental moment when disgust responses are most active and least tempered by the experience and context that might, in later years, soften them somewhat. The rumor was not merely well designed for its demographic. The demographic was, in the most precise biological sense, primed for it. The children passing the rumor along were not unusual in their response to it. They were responding exactly as children of that age respond to exactly this kind of information, which is to say, strongly, immediately, and with a conviction that is difficult to dislodge by subsequent rational argument. A classroom in the early 1980s. A teacher stands at the front and explains, clearly and calmly, that the rumor is not true. She has perhaps looked into it. She has perhaps read the denial that Lifesavers Inc. published in newspapers and sent to school principals. She lists carefully the actual ingredients of bubble yum. She explains, in terms appropriate for the age group, why the manufacturing process makes the described contamination impossible. The children in the room nod along. They follow the logic. They understand the argument. And then they leave the classroom, and the feeling is still there, not quite resolved, sitting somewhere between the argument they have just heard and the image that arrived when the rumor was first described to them. The pale eggs, the softness, the too-good-to-be-true texture of something they have been chewing, without knowing what it really was. The argument and the feeling do not quite meet. The anterior insula does not update on the basis of a list of ingredients. This gap between what people know intellectually and what they feel is one of the things that makes food contamination myths particularly persistent. Other kinds of false beliefs can sometimes be dislodged by clear and credible counter-evidence. If someone believes a false historical claim, a reliable source can sometimes correct it effectively. But beliefs rooted in disgust operate by a different mechanism, one that is not primarily responsive to propositional argument. The feeling is not a conclusion reached by reasoning. It is a response generated by a system that does not reason in the usual sense, that generates its outputs faster than deliberate thought can intercept them, and that is designed to err on the side of rejection. Telling that system that the object is clean does not turn it off. The feeling persists alongside the knowledge, which is why the woman in the research room could understand perfectly well that the juice was unaltered and still not drink it. There is something worth holding gently here, something that is easy to miss if the focus stays too narrowly on what was false about the rumor. The children who believed it were not credulous in some unusual or pathological way. They were not less intelligent or less capable of reason than children who did not encounter the rumor, or than adults who would later dismiss it with a confident shake of the head. They were responding with great consistency and reliability to a set of inputs that their nervous systems were built to respond to in exactly that way. The disgust response activated because it was supposed to activate. The rumor spread because it matched the template that makes information travel easily through a social network, personal testimony, borrowed authority, a familiar product, a hidden biological threat. The feeling persisted because feelings rooted in disgust are not primarily overwritten by counter-argument. This is, in the end, one of the more useful things that the spider egg rumor offers to careful examination. Not the falseness of the claim itself, which is simple enough once examined, but the precision with which it fit every contour of the psychological landscape it entered, the softness of the gum, which was real and unexplained, the developmental moment of its primary audience, which was precisely the moment of peak disgust sensitivity, the mechanism by which it traveled, which was exactly the personal testimony structure most effective at bypassing skepticism, the specific contaminant it described, which was exactly the kind of biological object most likely to activate a strong and persistent disgust response. None of this was designed. No one sat down and engineered a maximally effective food contamination rumor for the 1977 bubblegum market. It emerged, as most effective rumors do, from a kind of spontaneous fit between a story and the minds that received it. Rosen's woman sits at her table with the glass of juice in front of her, and the glass is still there, still untouched, still the same pale gold it was when it was poured. She knows it is safe. She knows the water in it is the same water it was before. She knows that the object briefly touching its surface left nothing behind that any instrument could detect. And still her hands are in her lap and not around the glass, because the system is older than her knowledge and runs faster than her reasoning, and it is doing exactly what it was built to do, which is to keep her safe from things she cannot see. The glass is not contaminated. The system is not malfunctioning. Both of these things are true at the same time, and sitting with both of them is in the end more interesting than choosing only one. The children at their lunch tables in 1977, holding the pink gum slightly away from their faces, were running the same calculation. Their anterior insulae had activated on a verbal description of something they had not seen and that did not exist. Their hands held the gum with a new and altered certainty that it was not what they had thought it was, even though nothing about it had changed. They were not wrong to feel what they felt. They were not being foolish or weak-minded or easily manipulated. They were being children whose nervous systems were doing the thing nervous systems of that age do, with great speed and consistency and thoroughness, in response to exactly the kind of information that nervous systems of that age are most prepared to respond to. The rumor found them ready for it, in the way that water finds the low places in a field, not because of anything wrong with the field, but because of the simple and elegant operation of the laws that govern where water goes. The spider egg story flowed along the social networks of children in exactly the channels those networks were designed to carry, arrived in exactly the minds that were most prepared to receive it and pass it on, and produced exactly the response that the described contamination was most suited to produce. It was, in every structural sense, a nearly perfect fit between a story and the minds that held it, and the fit was not accidental. It was the result of a very long accumulation of human experience, written not in words, but in the structure of the nervous system, in the architecture of the disgust response, in the developmental timetable of a species learning, year by year and generation by generation, what it is safe to put in its mouth. A child on a school bus, leaning close to a friend, with one hand cupped near her mouth, speaking just quietly enough that only the person next to her can hear, is doing something very old. She is passing along a warning. The warning happens to be false, but the behavior, the leaning in, the lowered voice, the particular urgency of someone who has information they believe is important, is not a mistake or a corruption of something that should work better. It is the information sharing system of a social species operating in the mode it reserves for threats that feel immediate and personal and real. She is certain of what she is saying because it came to her from someone who was also certain, and certainty of that kind travels easily from one nervous system to another. It does not pause at the boundaries of accuracy. It does not stop to ask whether the chain of testimony connecting it to the original event is reliable. It moves, as warnings do, with the speed appropriate to things that should not be ignored. What developmental research has found, tracing this arc across childhood and into adolescence, is that the ability to moderate that kind of certainty, to hold a strong feeling alongside a careful question about whether the feeling is warranted, develops gradually, unevenly, and very much later than the feeling itself. The child on the bus has the feeling, the capacity to sit with the feeling and examine it at the same time, to let the argument and the emotion occupy the same space without one simply defeating the other, is something that arrives in its fullest form only after years of practicing exactly that difficult, unglamorous cognitive work. The children in the cafeteria were not yet there. Most adults, if they are honest, find that work difficult even with the years behind them. There is something generous in what the research ultimately reveals about the people who believed and passed along this particular story. Not pity, not condescension, not the mild superiority of someone who has looked up the facts and found them lacking. Something closer to recognition, the kind that comes from understanding that the thing being examined is not a failure of human reasoning, but an expression of human architecture. The anterior insula that lights up at a verbal description of contamination is the same structure that has, over a very long period, kept people from eating things that would have killed them. The law of contagion that makes the glass of juice undrinkable is the same principle that produces genuine food safety behavior in contexts where the contamination is real and the stakes are high. The developmental peak of disgust sensitivity in early adolescence is the same developmental moment in which a young person is acquiring, rapidly and urgently, the social and biological knowledge that will govern their relationship with their environment for the rest of their life. The children who held the pink gum away from their faces were not wrong to feel what they felt. Their brains were doing exactly what brains are built to do, running old calculations at high speed, erring on the side of caution, treating the imagined contamination as though it were real, because the cost of that error is low, and the cost of the opposite error is not. The gum was fine. The children were fine. The systems running in the children were fine. And the rumor that moved through the schoolyards and cafeterias and school buses of 1977 was not a sign that something had gone wrong with the children who believed it. It was a sign that something had gone right with the species that built them, that the old systems were still in place, still running, still producing their reliable outputs, still keeping watch against the things that cannot be seen, with the same unhurried thoroughness they have always brought to that particular and very long-standing task. A glass of pale gold juice sits on a table in a quiet room. The room is still. The glass is untouched. A woman sits across from it with her hands folded in her lap, and she knows everything she needs to know about what is in the glass. And still the old calculation runs, patient and unhurried, doing the work it was always meant to do. And there is nothing in that moment that requires correction, nothing that asks for a different response, only the quiet and entirely understandable fact of a mind doing exactly what minds, in the end, have always done. John Gilchrist was in his 30s when a journalist asked him, for what was probably not the first time, whether he was dead. He smiled. He said he was not. He had been saying this in one form or another since he was a child, since the rumor first found its way back to him that the boy from the Life cereal commercials had mixed Pop Rocks with soda and died from it, his stomach rupturing from the gas, which was not true in any particular. He was alive. He had always been alive. The commercial had aired in 1972 when he was 3 years old, and the rumor had arrived not long after, attaching itself to his image the way rumors attach themselves to things that are widely known and only imperfectly understood. He described the experience without much bitterness. It was, he said, a strange thing to carry, not painful exactly, more like a persistent small correction that never quite finished correcting. Someone would always not yet know. Someone would always be hearing it for the first time in a school cafeteria or on a playground, from a person who had heard it from someone who had seen it confirmed, somewhere, by someone who knew, and he would go on being alive regardless of what the rumor said, sitting in ordinary rooms, answering the same question with the same mild answer. The facts of his continued existence, unchanged by how many people had heard otherwise. The rumor about John Gilchrist and Pop Rocks occupied the same cultural territory as the spider egg legend. It had a named victim. It had a product that behaved in an unexplained way, the small candy that popped and fizzed on the tongue, which did something most candies did not do, and which therefore invited the question of what else it might do. Taken further, taken in combination, taken to an extreme that the body could not withstand. General Foods, the company that made Pop Rocks, eventually set up a telephone hotline for parents who wanted reassurance. They sent letters to school principals across the country. The letters were calm and direct and listed the facts plainly. The candy contained carbon dioxide. The amount was small. It had been studied. It was safe. And the rumor went on circulating anyway, because the letters reached the principals, and the principals read them at their desks. But the rumor traveled by a different route entirely. It moved through children at lunch on the bus, won you the particular register of urgent and personal knowledge that no printed letter has ever quite been able to enter. What the Pop Rocks rumor shared with the Bubble Yum rumor was not just the structure of a contamination story or the specific target of a commercially successful product aimed at children. It shared a quality of attachment, the way it adhered to its subject and resisted removal, the way facts slid off it while the story itself held. The story had a person in it. The story had something that happened. The story had the borrowed weight of someone who supposedly knew, who had been there, who could testify. Against that particular form of evidence, a telephone hotline and a letter to a principal did not have quite the same purchase. A different kind of rumor, one without a body, without a product, with any unusual sensory property, without a victim named or unnamed, found its way to a soda brand in Brooklyn in 1990. Tropical Fantasy was a line of fruit-flavored sodas produced by the Brooklyn Bottling Group, a family-owned company that had been in operation since the 1930s. The sodas were inexpensive and brightly labeled and sold in bodegas and small grocery stores throughout the northeastern United States, and in the early 1990s, they had found a particularly strong market in black communities in New York and New Jersey. The rumor that began circulating in those communities around 1990 was not about spiders or about explosive chemical reactions. It claimed that tropical fantasy contained an ingredient intended to sterilize black men, that the product was, beneath its ordinary fruit-colored surface, a vehicle for deliberate harm. The rumor spread with speed and with genuine conviction. Sales collapsed. The Brooklyn Bottling Group, whose workforce was itself predominantly composed of people from minority communities, watched revenue fall and spent years trying to find a way back. The company's owners opened the facility to tours. They worked with civil rights leaders to address the damage. They documented their ingredients and their processes and made the information available. None of it worked quickly. The rumor had arrived in a context that gave it traction that no correction could simply dissolve. It landed in communities with documented historical reasons to distrust certain commercial and government institutions, and it drew on that history to make itself feel like recognition rather than error. The fear it produced was not irrational, given what those communities knew. What was wrong was only the specific claim, not the general awareness that had given the claim somewhere to root. Folklorists who have looked at that rumor tend to hold it carefully. It belongs to the same broad family as the spider egg legend, the hidden contamination in a trusted commercial product, the warning passed through personal relationships, the difficulty of dislodging a story once it has found a population that half expects to believe it. But it is not quite the same story. It carries weight the bubble yum rumor does not carry. It was not a schoolyard confusion about an unusual texture. It was something a specific community of people believed, for reasons that were not simply about disgust psychology or the novelty of a soft-style gum, and the harm it caused was not only to a product. The Brooklyn Bottling Group continued to operate, tropical fantasy continued to be produced. Sales recovered, slowly, over years, and the soda remained on bodega shelves, its bright labels facing outward, its ingredients unchanged. The bottles sitting in their ordinary rows beside other drinks, while the rumor that had tried to end them moved on and eventually faded into something that most people, ordering a cold drink on a summer afternoon, no longer thought about at all. A Snapple bottle held up to a window so that afternoon light passes through the liquid, shows the ship printed on the label in clear silhouette, a small sailing vessel on a stylized sea, sitting beneath the brand name in the particular way that historical imagery sits on a product that wants to suggest heritage and wholesomeness. In the early 1990s, a rumor circulated that the ship was not a historical image, and the K printed elsewhere on the label was not a kosher certification mark from the Orthodox Union. The rumor said the ship was a slave ship, and the K stood for the Ku Klux Klan. Neither was true. The ship was the Boston Tea Party vessel, consistent with the brand's American imagery, and the K was exactly what it appeared to be, a certification mark indicating the product met kosher dietary standards. The company stated this plainly and repeatedly. The rumor went on for a while, and then it did not, leaving behind it a faint residue in the kind of trivia collections where food rumors tend to end up, listed alongside other stories that turned out to be wrong. What these stories have in common is not their content. The spider egg legend and the Pop Rocks death rumor and the tropical fantasy sterilization claim and the Snapple Clan symbol story differ from each other in almost every meaningful way, in what they describe, in who they threatened, in the communities they moved through, in the degree of harm they caused, in whether the fear behind them had any historical basis. What they share is something more formal, the structure, the trusted commercial product, the hidden threat, the personal testimony of someone who knows. The way the story moves not through institutions but through relationships, forwarded by people who are not lying, who believe what they are passing on, who are doing the entirely ordinary human thing of sharing urgent information with people they care about. Folklorist Gary Allen Fine spent years documenting this structure across dozens of food contamination legends in American commercial culture, and the conclusion he reached was not that people are credulous or that corporations are poorly trusted, or that any particular era is more prone to this kind of story than another. The conclusion was simpler and in some ways more interesting. The stories persist because they do a specific job. They take the abstract anxiety of not knowing what is actually inside a commercial product, which is a genuine and reasonable uncertainty that most people manage by simply not thinking about it, and they convert that anxiety into a story with a clear shape. Someone found something, someone was harmed, someone knows the truth and is trying to tell you. The story gives the anxiety a place to go, and once it has a place to go, it is very difficult to call it back. The Bubble Yum spider egg legend emerged in the same year the product launched nationally, in 1977, which is one of the things Gary Allen Fine has described as legend-friendly timing. The product was everywhere, very suddenly. It was soft in a way no gum had been soft before. It was being chewed by millions of children who had no particular framework for understanding why it felt the way it felt, yielding and dense and different, in a way that was pleasant, but also, if the right question was asked at the right moment, slightly unexplained. The rumor arrived into that slight unease. It gave the unexplained texture and explanation, not a true one, but a story-shaped one, and story-shaped explanations have a particular durability that true explanations sometimes lack. Lifesavers Inc., the company that produced Bubble Yum, responded with the tools available to them. They ran advertisements in newspapers. The text was plain and direct, a calm column listing the actual ingredients of Bubble Yum, naming the rumor openly, inviting readers to consider what was actually in the product they were buying. The advertisements appeared in newspapers in several major markets in 1977. They were the kind of response that makes complete sense from the perspective of a company trying to protect its product with facts, and they probably helped somewhat in the way that facts help somewhat when they are presented clearly and given adequate distribution. The rumor continued to circulate for years after the advertisements ran, passed along by children who had not read any newspaper, in school cafeterias and on playgrounds, and in the back seats of cars, in the particular way that playground knowledge moves, not through publications but through people, one at a time close up. What is worth sitting with, at some distance from the urgency of the rumor's original spread, is how unremarkable the legend's trajectory actually was. A new product appeared with an unusual quality. An explanation for the unusual quality was invented, circulated, embellished, and passed along. The explanation was wrong. It was corrected, repeatedly, by the company and by journalists, and eventually by the internet, which made debunking food myths into something of a minor industry all on its own. The product continued to be made and sold. The rumor continued to be repeated in diminishing circles until it became the kind of thing that most people know as a historical curiosity, a story about a rumor rather than the rumor itself. There is a particular kind of candy mythology that seems to attach specifically to soft-style gum, to the format that arrived in the late 1970s and changed what gum felt like in a mouth. The hardness of older gums, the pale chiclets and the firm sticks of spearmint that had been the standard for decades, carried with them a kind of legibility. They were what they looked like. They had no novel quality that needed explaining. Bubble Yum and Bubblicious and Hubba Bubba were different. They were soft in a way that seemed to call for a reason, and when a reason wasn't provided by the manufacturer, the playground obligingly provided one of its own. that the provided reason involved spider eggs rather than, say, unusual softening agents or a new polymer blend, says something about the kind of explanation that feels satisfying to a child in 1977 in a cafeteria with a piece of pink gum in their hand that feels slightly mysterious. The mythology around candy, more broadly, has a long history in American culture. Folklorists have traced it back at least to the post-war period, when candy began to be produced at industrial scale and sold through national distribution networks, and when the distance between a child and the origin of the thing they were eating became wide enough that the middle of the process was essentially invisible. The candy appeared on the shelf, wrapped and sealed and brightly printed, and what happened before the shelf was a kind of blank, a large, warm, mechanical process that most people would never see, producing things that most people would eat without thinking much about it. The legends that developed in that gap were not random. They were almost without exception about what might be hiding in the blank, what might have slipped through, what might have been added, what the brightly printed wrapper might be concealing. The reassurance that nothing was hiding there, that the blank contained kettles and conveyors and quality control technicians and hairnets, that the process was regulated and monitored and designed specifically to prevent the kind of contamination the legends described, was available and remains available to anyone who wants to look for it. The FDA's requirements for food manufacturing are public. The manufacturing processes for products like Bubblegum are documented. The ingredients are listed on the packaging, but information of this kind addresses a different register than the one the legends operate in. The legends are not primarily about factual uncertainty. They are about something more visceral, more immediate, more connected to the feeling of putting something in your mouth that came from somewhere you have never been, made by people you have never met, through a process you have never seen. The facts address the intellectual question. The visceral question takes longer to settle, and sometimes it never quite does. John Gilchrist answered the question about his death so many times that it became a kind of signature, the one thing that set him apart from every other child actor who appeared in a single well-remembered commercial and then grew up into an ordinary life. He was alive, and he knew it, and he kept saying so, and the story kept circulating anyway, in smaller and smaller orbits as the decades passed, among people who were hearing it for the first time from someone who had just heard it from someone else. By the time the internet arrived and pop rock's myths found their way onto dedicated folklore websites and food history pages, the rumor was already mostly a historical object, something people knew as an example of a food legend, rather than as a live warning. Gilchrist himself eventually became something of a minor celebrity of the corrective, appearing in interviews to confirm, pleasantly, that he remained among the living. The Pop Rocks candy itself continued to be produced through several changes of ownership and distribution. It remained unusual in the way it always had been, small crystals that popped and fizzed on the tongue, which is not a common sensation and continues to surprise people who encounter it for the first time. The sensation it produces is entirely explained by carbon dioxide trapped in the candy during manufacturing and released when the candy dissolves in saliva. The explanation is simple and complete and takes about a sentence to convey. It does nothing to diminish the sensation, which remains exactly what it is, regardless of how well it is understood. The candy pops, the carbon dioxide releases, nothing else happens. The child who puts it in their mouth and feels it pop is experiencing exactly what is described on the package, and nothing more, and the rumor that described something more dramatic has been settled for decades in every factual source that touches on it, while the candy itself goes on sitting in display racks near checkout counters, waiting to be surprising again to someone who has never tried it. There is something in the persistence of all these legends, the spider eggs, and the exploding stomach, and the sterilization ingredient, and the sinister label symbol, that is not simply about credulity or about any particular failure of education or information access. The stories persist, in part because they are good stories. They have the qualities that make stories travel: a named subject, a clear threat, a plausible mechanism for the threat, and a personal connection to the teller. They are short enough to pass along in a single conversation. They are specific enough to feel like testimony rather than speculation. They have the particular authority of something that someone's friend, or someone's cousin, or someone's neighbor personally witnessed or experienced. Against stories with those qualities, plain facts have to work harder, and they do not always win, and even when they do win, they rarely win quickly. The Bubblegum legend had all of those qualities in its most developed form. By the time it had been circulating for a few years and accumulated its false details, the named hospital, the named child, the named doctor who had confirmed the eggs, it was, as a story, quite effective. It explained something unexplained. It warned of something frightening. It came from someone who knew that it was also entirely without factual basis, did not change those qualities. A story can be wholly invented and still be structurally very good at being a story, and structurally very good stories are structurally very good at moving through populations of people who are doing nothing more than sharing what they know with people they care about. The soft pink gum at the center of it all was, throughout this entire process, unchanged. It sat on shelves. It was purchased and unwrapped and chewed. Its particular texture, the yielding, dense softness that had triggered the rumor in the first place, did not change because of the rumor, and did not change because of the debunking, and did not change because of the newspaper advertisements, or the FDA regulations, or the documented manufacturing processes that made the rumor's central claim physically impossible. It remained what it had always been, a specific blend of synthetic polymers and softening agents and sweeteners, pressed into small rectangular pieces and wrapped in bright foil, available in most grocery stores and convenience stores for a small amount of money, designed for children and enjoyed by them in the ordinary course of being children. Folklore has a term for stories like this one, not for the spider egg legend specifically, but for the broad category of contemporary legend that circulates through modern consumer culture, attaching to brands and products and commercial processes the way older legends attach to haunted places and supernatural figures. The legends are sometimes called mercantile legends, and they share the quality of turning the everyday commercial landscape into a territory where hidden things move. The candy aisle becomes a place where something unseen has happened. The brightly printed wrapper conceals something. The familiar product harbors a secret. It is in some ways the same imaginative move that older cultures made when they looked at forests and rivers and felt that something lived there beyond what could be seen. The same impulse to populate the parts of the world that remain opaque to direct observation, to give shape to the blank, to make the unknown feel specific. What changes in the contemporary version is the setting. The forest becomes the factory. The river becomes the distribution chain. The spirits become spiders, or exploding gas, or deliberate poisons, or symbols of allegiance to things that should not be there. The structure is old, the products are new, and the legends keep arriving, generation after generation, finding new products with new unexplained qualities, new brands with new sudden popularity, new blanks in the commercial landscape that are large enough to hold a story. Bubblegum is still made. This is one of the quieter facts at the edge of the whole story. The product launched in 1977 survived the spider egg rumor, was acquired by several successive companies through the ordinary movement of brand ownership in the food industry, and continues to be manufactured and sold in the present day. The packaging has changed, the logo has been updated, the range of flavors has expanded and expanded again over the decades. But the gum itself, the particular soft texture that distinguished it from everything that came before it, that started the whole strange episode, remains carrying its recipe forward through time with the patient indifference of a commercial product that has outlasted the story told about it. A piece of it sits in a wire display rack on a convenience store counter somewhere right now, under a warm overhead light, its bright wrapper printed and sealed, its surface yielding inside the foil in the specific way it has always yielded. Outside the store, the street is whatever it is, lit or dark, warm or cold, busy or quiet, according to the hour. Inside, the rack holds its small assortment of gums and mints and candies in neat rows, each one a product with a history that most of the people who buy them will never think about, and do not need to think about because the history does not change what the product is or what it does. Children buy it, they unwrap it in the car or on the walk home, or sitting on a step somewhere, pressing a thumb into its surface the way children always have, feeling the particular give of it, and they chew it. Some of them have never heard the rumor. Some of them have heard it as a historical oddity, the same way they might know that people once thought the Earth was the center of the solar system, something that was believed at a distance by people who did not yet know better. Some small number of them have heard it recently, from a friend or a sibling or a cousin, in the particular tone of urgent personal knowledge that has never gone out of style, and are chewing the gum with a small edge of uncertainty that will probably fade by the time they get home. None of them are eating spider eggs. There are no spider eggs. There have never been spider eggs. The gum is soft because of how it is made, because of the specific polymers and softening agents that a team of food scientists developed in the early 1970s, working in an industrial kitchen somewhere, trying to produce a gum that felt different from the ones that already existed. They succeeded. The gum felt different. People noticed it felt different.